Can we really see through a bowl? Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today we're going to try to look through or see through this wood. Now this is a lot thicker than it's going to need to be before we're going to be able to see through it, because I can tell you right now I'm not seeing anything through this. This is a piece of sweet gum, and I've sealed the end grain with wax. So this little pink edge on here is old recycled wax candles, so that's not part of the wood. But what I've got is a piece of quarter sawn sweet gum. It's a hardwood, but it's a relatively lightweight hardwood. It grows in the southeast United States from Florida up to Illinois and everywhere in between. And there's some areas in South America where this grows. It has a really deep, rich, figured heartwood, which is really nice. And because this is a quarter sawn piece of sweet gum, we're going to have a lot of heartwood with a little bit of sapwood. We're going to see how that turns out. Now, if you want to learn more about what quarter sawn wood is and how to cut your blanks for quarter sawn wood and all sorts of other things, including and most importantly, how to prepare raw green wood so that it doesn't crack, then you're going to want to check out my Treatable Understanding Green Wood online course. I'll put a link for that in the description below, so you want to check that out. This sweet gum is going to turn really, really well. It's very wet. I just cut this not that long ago and it's been sealed, so there's a lot of moisture in here. We're going to make a very simple but very thin, see-through, hopefully see-through bowl out of this blank. We'll see what happens. So I'm going to put this on the lathe and we're going to get started and we'll see if we can see through it.
I'm going to mount this to the lathe using a drive center and tailstock. I like this method because it's simple, it works well, and I'm able to make minor adjustments as needed. I can loosen up this bowl blank and adjust it in the tailstock and get a slightly different position very easily, very quickly compared to a screw chuck or a faceplate. That's why I like using the drive center and the tailstock. Now I'm going to start off roughing this bowl blank with my 5/8 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. This is a great tool for removing a lot of material very quickly. And as you notice, I'm working on the corner of this bowl, so I'm basically shaping the bottom of the bowl and the side of the bowl all at the same time and bringing them into alignment of what the final bowl will look like. Sometimes I'm asked, why don't I just work the side and make this round and true and then come in and work the bottom? Well, I find that working it at about a 45-degree angle and shaping the bowl is the most efficient way to make these bowls quickly. As you can see here, I'm shaping the bowl and taking care of the exterior side of the bowl and the bottom of the bowl all at the same time. It's important to note too to move the tool rest in as you go, because you will be reaching a little bit farther over the tool rest with each pass, and you want to make sure that you've got good support there. So stop and move the tool rest up forward as you're doing these cuts. This wood is turning so smoothly, and the reason it turns so smoothly when it's wet or green, now keep in mind the term green basically means that it's wet wood. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's green colored, but it's wet wood. But the reason it turns so smoothly when it's wet is that all those fibers are plump full of water. They're basically all inflated, so they all cut pretty much evenly. A dry piece of wood has drier end grain fibers, so the end grain is much tougher than the side grain, so you'll have variations with each rotation of the bowl blank. On a dry bowl blank, you have a side grain that goes by that cuts relatively smooth compared to the end grain, and then the end grain comes by and it's harder and firmer and a little bit more difficult to turn. So you're going from difficult to easy to back and forth quickly. So there's a lot of variation with dry wood. With wet wood or green wood, it's basically all inflated with moisture evenly, so it cuts like a bar of soap almost. It feels like a piece of wax at times. It just cuts so smoothly. So if you ever get the opportunity to turn green wood, definitely take advantage of that. Now I'm shaping the tenon in the shoulder of this and establishing the base of the bowl. I like to get the tenon in the shoulder established right off because that gives me a connecting point. Now I know the top rim of the bowl needs to connect with this shoulder. Now, the shoulder will most likely turn into the base of the bowl when I'm done turning this. But for right now, that is the end point for the curve of the shape of this bowl. Then I'm just going to switch over to my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. I will do this entire bowl with my 5/8 inch and my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. Now the only other thing I will use is my spindle detail gouge, and I'll be using that for the tenon and then for removing the very end, the foot of the piece. I'm making a pretty aggressive cut here. I changed the camera view so you guys can see the profile and the shape of this bowl. Now, right now, I've got almost have a really nice flowing curve, except it comes to a flat bottom. You can see that high ridge in the bottom. That's not what I want right there. I need to address that right away. And the way I'm going to address that is with a pull cut or a scrape cut. I'm using the bottom wing of the bowl gouge to just scrape that material away. I'm not letting the top wing touch, but I'm holding the bowl gouge flute closed up against the surface where I'm cutting. Now this is a cut that you only want to do on the exterior of a bowl. If you try this on the interior of a bowl, you're going to get a nasty catch. So you don't want to do that. But you can see what I'm doing here. I'm just shaving away material. Now, the reason I'm using this pull cut is in that little corner, this is the only way to get into that corner very smoothly. I can't get around and get the tip of the bevel and the tip of the bowl gouge going down up into that groove. So instead I pull out a cut. Now I want to level off this rim. I'm going to use a similar push cut. And you can see I'm just using the lower edge of the bowl gouge to flatten off the top of this bowl. I needed to see exactly where the flat edge is going to be so that I know where my end point for the curve is. So essentially the exterior of the bowl is connecting the rim to the bottom of the bowl, in this case the shoulder which is attached to the tenon, and connecting those 2 points with a smooth curve. Here you can see the exterior of the bowl much better. There's a couple high spots in there, and I really want to take care of those high spots because I want the exterior of this bowl to be as close to perfect as I can make it. I had a little bit of a vibration there with my 1/2 inch bowl gouge because I'm extending over the tool rest quite a bit. So I've switched over to my 5/8 inch bowl gouge, which is a little bit heavier, and it's not as prone to vibrate as my 1/2 inch. You can see that little high spot up towards the rim that I'm dealing with right there. Now, take your time with the exterior of the bowl. As I've said many times, the exterior of the bowl is the bowl. It's what you'll touch. It's what you're going to pick up the bowl with. It's what you're going to look at. You're going to see the curve, the shape of the bowl. So take your time and make sure you get the exterior the way you want it. This is where you really want to fuss. When we work the interior of the bowl, basically the only thing we're doing is just copying or following the shape of the exterior of the bowl. So you want to spend all your time working on the exterior of the bowl and make sure you get it just the way you want. I'm just easing off those high spots. It's getting there. I've got some tool marks up there, but those will be taken care of here in just a moment. Now, I'm doing the final dovetail angle for the tenon after I've shaped the exterior of the bowl. Now, why would I do that? If I were doing a larger bowl or a bowl with thicker walls, I'm not even going to be that concerned with that. I would turn the entire tenon and then work the exterior of the bowl. But what I did here is, and because we're going to be making these walls very thin, what I'm doing is I want to make sure that that tenon location matches the current exterior of the bowl. What does that mean? Well, if the bowl had moved a little bit since I shaped the tenon initially and was working the exterior of the bowl, had I make the dovetailed portion of the tenon at that point, the last few cuts I was making on the exterior of the bowl might not line up with that tenon. So by cutting the tenon at the very end, I'm pretty much guaranteed that the tenon is going to match the rotation of the exterior of the bowl. Now, okay, so why is that also important? Which, by the way, I'm bringing up the tailstock here so that I have a little extra support, and I'm going back into a shear scrape here. Why would I be doing that? Well, because I'm going to be cutting this bowl so thin that I need the bowl to rotate perfectly true right now. So I'm just shaving away any little high spots that might remain. This also addresses those tool marks I had at the top of the rim right before I switched this over to the 4-jaw chuck. So by shaving this off, I'm taking off any high spots, and this bowl blank is turning perfectly true on the lathe at this point. What that means is when I start making those walls really thin, I won't have a thick exterior and a thin interior or exterior somewhere. So if I didn't take the time to do that, and I just had a kind of a sort of almost true bowl blank, but it was a little bit wobbly, well, the thick spot of the exterior is going to be very visible when I make that wall really thin. And if there's a low spot, it's going to become really thin there. So the bowl will have uneven wall thickness. By truing this bowl up, I'm able to ensure that the wall thickness is maintained consistently throughout. Now I'm making some really rough removal here with the tailstock in place. Because I was moving 90 degrees to the chuck, that's not a really good move to be doing very aggressively unless you've got a tailstock support. If you do that too hard, you're going to displace the bowl from the chuck and you're going to have some issues down the road. Well, look at that. By the way, look at that wood grain. Isn't that gorgeous? I love this wood. The heartwood, mixing heartwood with sapwood is somewhat controversial because they're two different densities and it doesn't always work well, but I just love the contrast of it. And that heartwood in this piece is absolutely beautiful. Okay, so I've worked away a little bit of the area around the rim. Now I'm going to establish the wall thickness. See how the outside of the bowl has no wobble in it? That's what we took our time with doing right there. Now I'm lining up the bevel of the bowl gouge with the exterior of the bowl. Again, that's why the exterior of the bowl is so important. I'm visually looking straight down on the bowl gouge, lining up the bevel edge of the bowl gouge with the exterior of the bowl and gently making my pass. I don't want to push in to the wall and I don't want to push away from the wall because that's going to make the wall thickness either too thin or too thick. I just want it to be parallel with the exterior of the bowl. And this is my 1/2" 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. The core of the center of this blank is absolutely essential to maintain balance on this outer rim of this bowl. If I had hollowed out the entire interior, this very thin wet bowl blank would be all wobbly along the outer edge and I would not be able to turn it very thin. I would have all kinds of chatter and thick and thin spots and tool marks everywhere. But because I have that center, it acts as like a stabilizing hub and keeps that exterior very, very stable while I'm turning. I'll just continue working down this wall. The lower area inside this bowl blank along the rim should be just a little bit thicker than the previous area that you just turned. And then what you want to do is you want to sneak up on the ideal thickness. So the very top rim of the bowl is your wall thickness. And you want that wall thickness to be maintained throughout the wall all the way down to the bottom of the bowl. So the way to achieve that is to just gradually sneak up on it. As you see here, I'm using a relatively dangerous technique by having the bowl gouge open with the flute open. But because I'm making such a light cut, it's not quite that big of a deal. You can see here, I'm going to engage the cutting edge of the bowl gouge and then just gently remove a thin area of the wall material until I sneak up on the wall thickness that is desired. I need to clear out some material here so that I can get down to that wall and work the next section. What you don't want to do with this, and what we talked about earlier about the wall wobbling, is you don't want to go back up to the rim now, especially when you work down into the bowl like this. We're almost halfway down into the bowl. We do not want to go up to that rim because there's a lot of movement in that rim. That means that rim's flexing back and forth. And just by contacting your tool incorrectly or having a little catch is going to cause a problem. Here's where I'm shaving off a very light area, super light cut there. All right, let's take a look at this. Now you can do a lot of this with just feeling it. You can feel the wall thickness and you get an idea where it is becoming thicker and thinner. And right here, I'm feeling at the bottom, it's still thick, and that's what I want. I'm not going to leave it thick, but I'm going to cut it to match the rest. What I don't want to do is overcut it. But before I do any more cutting, I need to sharpen my bowl gouge. My bowl gouge is best when it's sharp, and it doesn't take much to sharpen a bowl gouge. Basically, go over to your sharpening station and a couple passes over the CBN wheel and you are sharp again. But that sharp edge will make all the difference when you're making those very, very light, thin cuts to finish up those edges. So here you can see I've got the flute wide open and I'm just removing a very thin area to bring that wall thickness down to match the top part. You got to be careful with this. What you don't want to do is you don't want to make the area on the side or middle part of the bowl or down in the bottom of the bowl thinner than the rim, because there's no way to fix that. Take a look at this. There's the sapwood and the light shining through it. You can see right through, you can see the different shapes. Now the heartwood has more minerals and components in it than the sapwood, but look at that. You can see my fingers through there. You can see the shadow of my fingers. This thing is completely translucent, and that's because of the water and the moisture content in this wood. Super cool. It's such a neat thing to do. Now, if you're really good, you can actually use a light next to your piece, and you can use that light as your gauge to determine how thick that wall is. The brighter the light gets, the thinner the wall is. In this case, I'm just going to stop occasionally and check my wall thickness and bring it down. I'm going to remove a bunch of the center area here so that I've got more material to remove for the inside side wall. Just take your time. Now these are push cuts that are going into the headstock, so they're not as dangerous to do as side cuts like this. If you see the side cut I'm doing, puts a 90-degree pressure on the chuck and on the tenon. So you want to do those relatively light. It's not a big aggressive cut here. These are relatively light cuts. And then I'm working down to that inside wall shape and to the wall thickness. You can see it's still a little thick there, and that's what you want. You want to just sneak up on it, like I said before. Now I'm using my calipers. Now the way the calipers work is they have a pinch point on both sides, and you can pinch the thickness of the bowl wall. And on the opposite side of the calipers, you can look at the distance between the two pinch points, and you can determine how thick that wall is at the given point where you're pinching. And that's important to do. Once you get down to the point where your fingers are reaching in there a ways, it's a little tricky to determine with great accuracy how thick that wall is. And it's much better to see it using the calipers. Look at those shavings coming out of there. It's just turning so smooth. So you can see it's getting thicker here and here, but there's my wall thickness right there. So I need to go about that midpoint, and I need to make it thinner. It's thicker right there. So I'm going to bring that wall thickness down just a hair. If you can see, I'm removing a very small amount. I'm just sneaking up on this. So I'm pinching the 2 points together and I'm looking at the opposite side. So that's my wall thickness. So I pinch at the bottom and I can see it's a little thicker there. If I bring the calipers to the top rim, there's my top rim thickness. That's what I want to make the bottom. So I can see I have to remove just a touch from the bottom of the bowl compared to the rim of the bowl. So I'm going to come back in and I'm also ramping this. So you see I'm starting back a little bit. So it graduates and merges into the thicker area. So ideally you have a really nice even wall all the way throughout. Here I'm just checking one more time. That's looking pretty good. Very nice. Take your time with it. It's well worth the effort, and you get great results when you stop a little more often and check. It doesn't cost anything to stop and take a look and see where you are. I'm really surprised. Perhaps it has to do with the quarter saw nature of this bowl blank, but there's very little wobble in this. You saw how thin I was making that. This is less than 1/8 of an inch or about 3 millimeters thick. There is a little bit of wobble. If you look at the rim of the bowl, you can see that it's moving just a touch, but not much. It's not uncommon for a bowl this thin to start getting floppy on the rim or in the rim area. So as a tree grows and becomes more mature, the sapwood or the light colored wood remains at the core of the tree, and in each layer, each year, becomes thicker and thicker. Well, the trees retain different things inside the core or the heart of the tree over time. It usually takes a lot of extra time for a tree to mature and have heartwood. So in other words, this same sweet gum tree, if I had cut it down when it was maybe 20 years old, there might not be any heartwood in it at all. But this tree is much older and it has heartwood. So essentially the tree stores different things in that heartwood. Some trees store resin or oils. There's sugars. There are all sorts of different components that trees store that make up that heartwood. And the coloring of that heartwood could be made by different chemicals. You need to think of the tree as a big storage unit for all sorts of different chemicals and different components. Trees actually generate their own mechanisms to defend against enemies, whether they're insects or diseases and that. And sometimes those come out as colors. Sometimes they'll create different resins or toxins that will eliminate enemies and or stain the wood with different colors. And some of that's beautiful, but that is the tree's defense mechanism most of the time when you're seeing color inside of a tree. And it's a storage process as well. The tree can store all kinds of different things inside that heartwood. And there's also components of the cells that are no longer used, kind of like the attic space of a house. You have all the activity going around the doorways and the rooms that you use on a regular basis, but the attic is the space where hardly anything's happening. Well, that's sort of what's happening in the inside of a tree. Let's take a look again. Now we're almost at the bottom. You can see that even light brightness, and it's a little brighter in one area. That's because of the position of the light. But essentially, the wall thickness is pretty even, and it's translucent still, but it's not showing light through that heartwood, which is a good indication that there's a lot of minerals or different components inside that heartwood that do not allow light to transfer through them, which again, I just find that to be really, really cool. Just a gorgeous piece of wood. Now, sweet gum, unfortunately, as it dries, it doesn't maintain the crisp, vibrant color. So the sapwood will kind of become a little bit more dingy. it doesn't look quite as crisp as you're seeing right now. It's looking crisp right now because this wood is wet and fresh and it was just been turned. But as it dries, it'll change a bit. So I'm going to attach my jam chuck and I'm going to shape the foot of this bowl. Now, just so you're clear, this is what's called a once turned bowl. A once turned bowl is just that. It's turned once, the bowl is finished. However, because of the moisture content in this bowl is going to warp, it's going to change shape a little bit. It depends on how it's turned. Because this is turned so evenly, it may not warp in a tremendous amount. But it also depends on the grain of the wood too. This is also a quarter sawn piece of wood, which basically all of the grain is stacked up in one direction, so it should not distort dramatically. If you want to have a bowl that's perfectly round, you need to twice turn it. That means you turn it once rough and larger than the final size, and then after it's dried, you turn it again, and it stays true at that point. I'm going to do a back cut here to establish the thickness of the foot of the bowl. I want the thickness of the foot of the bowl to be very similar to the wall thickness. Now, why is that? Well, ideally, you want to have all components of the bowl be the same thickness, and that's because they will all release moisture at the same rate. If I were to leave a really thick bottom on this bowl and have those thin walls, the thick bottom will retain moisture much longer than the thin walls, and because of that, it will crack. If you have even walls on your final piece, you're going to have a lot less chance of cracking. Now, I'm switching over to my spindle detail gouge here, and I'm going to stop and take a look at this. And what I'm looking for is I'm making sure there's no imperfections in that nub, make sure there's no knots or anything, because I don't want to go much farther if that's the case. And you also do not want to apply more pressure with the tailstock at this point because it'll just crush that little nub and you won't be able to continue turning. So the way I separate this is just to whittle this down nice and thin and then apply a little forward pressure at the same time I turn off the lathe, and it will sever those fibers so they can get to the little nub will come right off, and it'll just leave an area that needs to be sanded smooth, and I'll be all set. Okay, so now this bowl is nowhere near being finished. It needs to be sanded still, but because it is sopping wet, I really can't sand it because it's just going to load up all the sandpaper. But I'm going to apply some Danish oil. This is tried and true brand Danish oil, which is pure linseed oil. And it's boiled linseed oil. When I say boiled linseed oil, this is boiled the old traditional way, not like the big commercial way. So anyway, that's a whole other issue. But essentially, the linseed oil on this, or the Danish oil, is going to seal the pores of the wood, and it's going to allow for a little bit more even drying. This is really not being applied as a finish at this point. This is being applied as it's almost like a sealer. This oil is going to assure that there's very little cracking or no cracking at all as this dries. And there it is. Look at that wood grain. Isn't that absolutely gorgeous? That's heartwood blended with sapwood. Now again, this is a quarter sawn bowl blank, and that's how this occurs. I've got a video all about quarter sawn bowls. You might want to check that out because it's worth learning how to do this, especially if you're cutting your own bowl blanks. But look at that final pattern, and look how thin those walls are.
So here's the final turned bowl. I think it turned out great. It's thin enough that we can see through it. It's translucent, not transparent, but translucent. It's letting light through, and you can see shadows through the other side, which is really cool. I think that's awesome. Now, this translucency will dissipate as the wood dries. Part of the reason why this is translucent is because of the moisture content of the wood. As it dries, it's going to change and it's going to become a little more opaque, but it's still relatively thin. Now, this piece is really wet and I'm not able to sand it. There are some tool marks in here, which is not a big deal. These can be hand sanded out after this dries. And this is going to dry in a matter of a couple days. It's going to dry very quickly. And because it is a quarter sawn piece of wood, it is going to dry from the sides in a little bit. So these sides are going to compress just a little bit. So this perfect circle that you see right now won't be here once this dries. So that's something to keep in mind when you do a once turned bowl. It's also the reason why if you do want a nice round bowl, you want to do a twice turned bowl. And I've got videos all on those, so you want to check those out. All right, guys, let me know if you're going to do a thin walled bowl like this and try this out. Keep in mind that what you really want to do when you're working those thin walls is just sneak up on that wall thickness. You don't want to get too aggressive. You don't want to go overboard and dig too deep and make a really thin area down in the side of the bowl. Instead, you want to gradually just keep making that wall the same thickness as the previous portions of the wall and just sneak up on that wall thickness as you work your way down the inside of the bowl. So take your time and you too can make a bowl like this if you haven't already. So if you're going to do this, if you're going to try it, or if you've already tried it, leave me a comment below and let me know how it went for you. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Be sure to check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. There you're going to find all kinds of information about turning wood bowls. Plus, I have several courses that go into great detail teaching you exactly what you need to know to be able to turn bowls like you're seeing here. So check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. Be sure to subscribe to this channel if you're not already, and click that like button. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, happy turning.